Welcome to Sober Dad Crew, the podcast where we talk about all things sobriety, recovery, parenting, music, tattoos, work, and more. For more information, please visit soberdadcrew.com. My guest this episode is Eli Goldaris. He's a sober dad who began his journey to sobriety as a platoon leader and Army officer. We talk about his time in the military, parenting, sobriety, and why the idea of unlimited paid time off just might not be as cool as it sounds. All right, Eli, welcome to Sober Dad Crew.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be on. I must admit this is my first ever podcast, so I feel special.
Yeah, that it's a lot of people's first, so it's kind of fun. There was a period I got a kind of few famous people, and that was like, oh, I'm just going to interview all these famous people. Well, that's like really hard.
Sure.
And also a little less interesting, I think, in the end. That sort of whatever, regular, sort of a weird word, but just, you know, people who aren't famous, people who have stories, I think in some ways that resonates a little more.
Yeah, no, happy to be here. Happy to be just a regular, non-famous guy for you.
There's a lot of us out there just doing our dad thing.
Right.
So how many kids do you have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have a soon-to-be 2-year-old in December, and then I have a boy on the way in February. So I guess according to the state of Texas, I have 2 kids.
I always get political on this show. I just am like, don't do it. I got in trouble at one point because I put up a Kamala post and pissed some people off. But
yeah, it happens.
You know, it's my podcast.
That's right.
I can do my thing. So yeah, you're like, man, you're going to be living in the world of diapers for a while.
That's right. Yeah. I thought I was going to get a little bit of a reprieve. We weren't essentially planning for another one, but it's God's gift. So we'll take it as it is.
Things happen. Yeah, that's why I got a vasectomy, but I'm old. So, and I have 4 kids. So
yeah,
I don't need any more.
Yeah, two might be it for me. So we'll see. I people say it gets a little bit easier after one, but
you just give up. I mean, 2 of mine who are 17 and 21 are biological, and then the younger 2 of my stepkids, but they're really, I just view them as my kids. So they're, there's a big age range of 8, 12, 17, and 21. So I'm sort of in many age ranges all at once, but it's funny. We have a young coworker, and they have a 3-month-old now, and she brought him in the other day. I was like, man, it seems like yesterday. It goes so fast.
Yeah, I mean, like even now, it's like my entire phone camera roll is my daughter, and then like I'll look back at some of the older ones of her, and I was like, man, that feels like she was just yesterday, but just it's like they develop so quick and so fast. It's kind of crazy how much growth she's had in such a short amount of time.
And that like real infant period is actually super short. It's like really not that long, but it's so cool to see him develop too. Like, 2 is that like first push into independence. And that's kind of like, it can be frustrating, but it's also sort of neat to see this young human like unveiling a little bit their personality and who they're going to be.
Yeah. It's funny. It's like that old show when I was growing up, or maybe even predates me a bit. Like the kids say the darndest things. Like already, it's just kind of hilarious. Some of the stuff that comes out of my daughter's mouth. It's like, oh my goodness! Like where do they even get this stuff?
Yeah, wasn't that hosted by the now not so great Bill Cosby? We used to love fucking Bill Cosby. I'm old enough that we watched the Cosby Show as a family. We're like, oh, that's so good. And we're like, oh no, Bill, dude. Yeah, you're like beyond me too.
That's right. But I think technically he's out of jail, right? He's a free man.
Oh, maybe. I don't always keep up with all that, but there's others now. Puffy.
Right, yeah,
not so good.
Not so good. Yeah.
Yeah, my middle school daughter says there's all these boys who are like, let's have a puff party. And I'm like, do these fucking kids even know what they're talking about? I hope they don't, because they're like 12. Or maybe they do. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. It's just a crazy time. And yeah, it's hard to know, like, especially because I feel like my daughter just repeats stuff that she hears, and it's like, oh my goodness, like I really hope she's just repeating and doesn't know that she shouldn't probably be saying that.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of that I think is eventually just have to be like, you can't say that. And social media is wild because they're like hearing stuff without context like that. They're not actually like in the New York Times reading the story. Did you always want to be a dad? Did you like know that was a thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I feel like I had a variant perspective of like the timing for when I wanted to be a dad. Um, I think it's important for people who get into like relationships that end up in marriage, that you have like a pretty good idea of your wife's background and like where they came from. Because for me, I grew up in a pretty like metropolis area. I'm not crazy, but like suburban suburban Minneapolis. So there was about 1,000, 2,000 kids in my high school. My dad and mom didn't really have me till like my dad was like 38, so that like much like later in life. And then my wife grew up in like a very small town, kind of like rural Kansas. She had like 80 kids in her high school class, and so for her it was just a much more like culturally acceptable, which it's funny to say there's like different cultures within the United States, but really for her it was like, hey, you kind of get married young, you kind of have kids young. So by the time that we got married, some of her closest friends had already had like one or two kids, so she was like ready to go. And for me, I was thinking like, oh man, I'll be like mid-30s by the time I even think about having a kid. But we just kind of met in the middle and had our first kid when we were both like 29. So always knew I wanted to be a dad. I just, like you never really truly, predict how your life's going to turn out or the timing for anything. So, just kind of taking it, as it comes.
Yeah. So, and this is so where we really start to dig in a little bit, and to the extent that makes sense and is comfortable to you, can you sort of talk about your relationship with substances and that journey for you?
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, I think it's one of those things where like anyone that knows me knows that I don't drink. I gave it up about a decade ago. And it's one of those things that like I think it's not like I'm ever pressured, but it's just there's so many like social events in your life where like alcohol gets brought up, or like it's like a part of the thing, whether you're at family events, you're at weddings, you're at like you're grilling out with some friends. But for me, I really kind of I read a lot of books when I was a kid, and there was a book series that I really loved by an author named Nicholas Nassim Taleb, and he wrote a whole series. And it's basically like, how do you understand risk? And so there's different like mental models, what he calls heuristics, for understanding risk in the real world. And there's certain things that you can do, these certain kind of like rules of thumb, call it, that can help you really like evaluate the world or around you. And so one of his things is called the Indi principle. And essentially it says that anything that's old but still exists today is probably more valuable than new things, right? So it's like sometimes like you hear like, hey, there's like mother's tales, but sometimes like these old golden rules kind of are more relevant than some of the stuff that happens kind of in the newer day. So that's to be said. It really like I like to study history and like read old texts that are still published. And this is kind of a long-winded answer to the sobriety here, but just to give you kind of some context. So when I graduated from the University of Indiana, I became an Army officer, and so it was really an interesting role because for those that don't know how the military works, like when you're an Army officer, you're essentially like day one, you're put in charge of a platoon of soldiers, some of which that are older than you by by many years, but because of the route that you took to get into the military, you're essentially kind of quote unquote like in charge of them. So I wanted to figure out like, hey, like, this is me like having to grow up pretty quickly, and be an adult, and I was kind of a goofball in college, and now it's like I have a very big responsibility. I'm responsible for the soldiers, for to make sure that they get home to their families, their loved ones, and so I kind of went down this path where I was reading a bunch of like historical texts, like learning about like historical generals and kind of different codes, and so I came across like the Bushido code, which is like the ancient like samurai code, and I was using this Indi principle, which basically said like, hey, there's probably a lot of good lessons that they have here that can really be insightful and inform me about like what it means to be a good leader. And one of them was, what does it mean to be disciplined? Like, and I think everyone like has a first guttural reaction. Like if you say, hey, what does it mean, discipline? People can say like, okay, like I think I know what that means. But then if you really think about it, like what does it truly mean to be disciplined? And so in the samurai culture, they practice, kata, which is this kind of like, ancient, like martial arts type preparedness. And there's really, is this process about learning, like, right, like to sacrifice, to be frugal, to really give yourself to something. And you have to go through something, like you have to have a real, like physical and emotional response to be disciplined. And so that kind of gets back to the sobriety, right? So there's this phrase in sobriety, which is called like, going cold turkey, right? And that phrase, originates from like the 18th century when, doctors would recommend, like people that were addicted to alcohol, pre-prohibition or drugs to just kind of, go cold turkey. And it's called cold turkey because people would have these like physical and emotional reactions where they have goosebumps, they'd be very uncomfortable, and it'd be reminiscent of what like a cold turkey looks like kind of very gross and scaly and bumpy. And there's a lot of historical reason why you do that, because, their belief was that you need to really like give yourself, you have to have a level of discipline. So to kind of bring it all home here, is I really thought like, hey, I knew that I, had used alcohol a lot when I was in college. I knew for what the role I had to do, it wasn't going to be something that if I needed to grow up quickly that I could continue to do. And so I went cold turkey and I just cut it completely out. And it was tough at first, but now I've done it. It's been since 2016. And I haven't had a drop of alcohol. And I think it's insightful because at the end of the day, like no matter whatever challenge or obstacle that I face in life, I can say like, hey, I'm disciplined. I know what discipline means because I had to give up and I had to sacrifice and I had to really go through this like emotional and physical experience to kind of break through to the other side. So that's really kind of been my whole journey with sobriety and why I don't drink still to today.
Yeah, a couple things. I think at first it does feel like a sacrifice, but I think it's been like I'll be 15 years this coming February. And there is, at least for me, a moment where like, oh, this is a gift.
Yeah.
It was like hard at first. And I was like you, I just stopped. I didn't do a program one night. It was like, I'm done. This is not good. Mm-hmm. And I never looked back. And there was a moment along the way you're like, oh, this is a gift. This is a gift to like everything, like kids, my job, my spouse, like all the things are like better because of that. Did you like identify as having substance use disorder, or were you just like, this is not the way for me?
Yeah, I think like I'm very much like an all or none kind of guy, and that's something that I've always realized. Like for me, like you get me around like a container of Oreos, I can't say like, hey, I'm just gonna have like one or two. Like I don't have that control. Like I'll probably eat a whole sleeve.
Thin mints, jelly beans. Yeah,
exactly. But if I see an Oreo container and I say, I'm not going to touch it, like I'm not even going to open it, then I can avoid it. And so I think that's kind of the mentality that I had to take. Like, hey, if I'm going to cut it out, it has to be like an all or nothing.
You warned us. You were on the edge of nap time. It's all good. It's all good. No, it's what we do.
Yeah, there's a 2-year-old, so yeah. Sometimes mom's her favorite, but then when dad's in his office, then I become the favorite, and then she wants to come in during phone calls and stuff, and so it's always a juggling act.
Yeah, we have a little of that because my wife, she's a therapist, but she also teaches college, and so a lot of that's remote. And so there's, for the youngest who's 8, there's the meetings you can come down and say hi.
Yeah.
And then the ones you can't. And it's not always an easy, hold fast thing.
Yeah.
When that happens, because it's usually evening time. So that's
definitely.
There are those transitional times when kids are younger. I mean, I guess all of us, right? If you're honest, like I have mental transition to and from work and all that. So I guess for everybody, transition time is there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's kind of like a cursing and blessing. I work home, most days, and so it's great that you can like take a break and go see your kid and like spend that time. But then there's like those boundaries where like they just think like you're accessible 24/7, and then and that's hard,
Yeah, they don't get work from home.
Yeah.
I mean, I mostly go into the office. It's a funny work world right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like I like going into the office. I like people, but I also drive 40 minutes. So, that's real gas and real money in the tank. But I do prefer to be with my colleagues. We're like playing around with different, like, should we give everybody Friday as an option, or should it be floated? We're trying to sort of explore like sort of post-pandemic back to work things. Like what's the balance that keeps people happy?
Yeah.
What are other firms doing? What works for us? It's just still, I think businesses are figuring that out.
Yeah, no, it's definitely like a weird time because you really like opened Pandora's box for a lot of employees. And I think a lot of people kind of got a taste of what working from home was that they may have never experienced had there been no pandemic. And sometimes it's kind of tough to put that back in the bag. And I think, it's really just becoming kind of an issue. I have like a good neighbor that works for Amazon, and Amazon last week came out kind of publicly and said like, hey, like we're 5 days back in the office, like no questions asked. And he's like, man, I'm like my inbox flooded with recruiters thinking like, hey, this is prime, time to like, poach people. And so I think there's still a lot that needs to be like worked out that it's not settled. And I think the hybrid model probably sticks around forever, but it's definitely a very unique and kind of interesting question. I think, once we kind of broke through and people have experienced what it's like, it's near impossible, if not impossible, to like, have a strict across the board, because now it's like a competitive advantage for companies that believe they can work well, remote or hybrid.
Yeah, it is interesting because I also see, we have younger staff. I work at an architecture firm, and, there is a little, like if you're a young, just post-college person, you might not actually have a good setup, right? Like you've got roommates, you're actually not in a world where that works, right? And then, so you keep coming in and you're like, wow, all the people who are high up aren't here, but I'm here. And so there's like, I don't know, resentment might be too strong a word, but it makes people sort of feel like there's a bit of a double standard. But I tell you, the world of recruitment is real. Like in my industry, I mean, I'm business development and marketing, but like I just got hit up the other day and it was like significant money, but I know enough and what to look at that it was like 50% travel. And like, for no way, like more money can be good, but it actually, if you're at a certain point, it's not the be all end all. But, so I spend a lot of time because I manage our website and our careers page and all that. I'm like, what are other people doing? What are they saying? How are they showcasing their firm? And that work from home or hybrid work. I mean, the place that hit me up, they were a 3-day in the office kind of thing, 2-day remote. So people are finding all these other ways. As a parent, what I really want is just to know I can be flexible if I need to, or, I'm old enough that my parents are older. Like if I needed to go there and help out, that I could just bring my laptop and work remote from there. Like that, to me, that flexibility is more important than like, oh, every Friday you can do this. I'm like, well, maybe I don't want it to be every Friday. I just kind of want it when I need it. Like,
I think that's really like the best way is to like treat everyone as adults and be like, understand that certain people have certain circumstances but I think no one has really figured it out. So it's just going to be kind of like it's going to be all across the board. And for some firms, for some industries, it works great. And then others, it's just more of like 5 days, 4 days type deal. But it definitely, I think, a good time for the recruiters to like, to find people where that matters. Because it's just like another thing. It's like every few years they find something that like they think matters to the to employees, and that's really kind of what they harp on. I think for years when we were more pension based, right, there were like other things that didn't matter, and then now it's like, hey, there's different benefits, and that was like really big for the years going into the pandemic, and now it's like, okay, not just benefits, but it's like, hey, where do you want to work as well? And I think it makes a really, really interesting landscape. Good and bad, of course.
Yeah, pensions are like a mythical creature.
Yeah,
right. That's like a unicorn.
Yeah,
I mean, my in-laws were both lifelong teachers and are on a pension. And there's, one of the dads of the girl on my daughter's soccer team. He was a police officer, and he's like my age, and he got out. He was like, I am done. I hit my thing. Nothing really terrible happened. I'm done. I'm like done, which I totally can understand in that field. I think the most interesting thing for me as I was digging into this stuff is that unlimited PTO thing that gets put out there. And I started researching that. I'm like, oh, that's not as cool as what it sounds like. Because you basically are guaranteed no PTO.
No, it's exactly. Kind of. I've lived through both, and I can tell you that the unlimited PTO is definitely not what at first blush you think it's going to be, because I think a couple of things happen. It's like one, when you're given days, you feel like you're kind of entitled to them, right? And so what ends up happening is that people like save up their days throughout the year. And then when the holidays come, it's like, hey, I'm going to take 2 weeks. I'm going to take 3 weeks because this is the days you gave me. I haven't used them. Here's my proof. Boom, go. And I think what ends up happening is when you don't have those days, then it's hard to be like, oh, I'm going to take 2 weeks off for Christmas and Thanksgiving, because it's like, you've unlimited. Right. So you don't feel like you have this like justified amount because you get unlimited. So it's like this very, interesting way that they kind of flip it on the employee, and they no longer kind of have this leverage of like, hey, you gave me 30 days, so I'm going to use 30 days. It's not like you gave me unlimited. And so now I feel silly trying to get like these blocks of time at the end of the year. So that's a huge one. And then I know too, just from like a cost saving perspective, sometimes when you're about to quit a job or leave, you're like, hey, I have 2 weeks of PTO, and that's like, cash in the bank. But now when you have unlimited, right, they don't owe you anything, because it's just like, well, we don't pay out because we don't have the PTO.
Because you don't have any.
You don't have any. So it's really this very kind of interesting way of doing it, because, it's like, when you feel, when you're given, 20 days, you feel like, hey, you're entitled to those days. But when you're not really given a set number, then you feel weird about feeling like you're entitled to anything, even though technically you can take PTO off whenever. So it's kind of this interesting thing that I think they realized, some employers realized like, oh, we can actually get less days, from employees by giving them unlimited, because there'll just be this like work and social pressure where they don't feel like they can like justify taking like, a few week blocks at a time.
Yeah, but it was sort of brilliant marketing. I was like, that's kind of, it's like when everyone's like, drink a lot of red wine, it's so healthy for you. It's just, you'll never have a heart attack if you drink 4 glasses of red wine a night. It'd be in some chocolate. It's all good.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's just it's an interesting time in work. How do you feel like your work world, you said you work from home and parenting, like, do you keep normal hours? Like, how does that intersect between work and sort of family life balance for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually am in a unique position where I, with another partner, started a company. So we're, it's very different than being like a corporate employee now. We have a lot more, it's the same thing with like, being having unlimited PTO. I would say you could use the same kind of an analogy for what it's like to be an entrepreneur, because technically, right, I could take off, whenever I want and structure my day however you want. But when you're the guy manning the ship, it's your responsibility to bring the revenue in. So if you're not bringing revenue in, then it's hard to justify like taking these days off. So, it's one of those things where it's like, people always want to be their own boss because, hey, that's great. But then sometimes you don't realize like, hey, when I show up to a corporation, like unless, things are going real south, chances are if I show up 9 to 5 and do a pretty good job, like that, I can go home and I can unwind at night and that check's coming to me. And when, you start your own company, that really goes out the window. It's like I'm working all the time unless I'm like hanging out with my family. So it just becomes like this thing kind of akin to like, unlimited PTO, where it sounds great to be your own boss and to do your own thing. But there is this level of like, hey, I have to grind. Otherwise, there's not money coming in, and then it's, then things don't go well. So.
Yeah. How many employees do you have?
Yeah. So there's about 3 of us right now. There's like, 2 main partners, and we get, we have a guy that helps us out. But yeah, I mean, as essentially, hopefully, next year we're looking to grow and scale, and then it's going to be like a whole different, ship, right? It's like, what a company is in the early days is very much different once you're taking on more people and roles and responsibilities. So we're just trying to get to a good place right now where we have like the foundation, in place to really kind of grow and scale it properly.
Yeah, I used to work in economic development, and you would see companies that grew too fast, and it was bad. And it wasn't always even by like, we're just going to do this thing. Like sometimes just they got a bunch of customers or they got huge orders, but they're trying to like scale up with employees and scale up with benefits and, in that tech world, scale up with venture capital. And, it's complicated. And all of a sudden, if you grow too fast and then the bottom comes out, you have mouths to feed.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think there's a lot of companies too that, you call them like 5-10 year overnight successes, where they're kind of like just humming along, nothing happens. And then they just get like a big break. They get like a big purchase order, or their product goes viral, or they have just like some immediate success where they like break through into a different industry. And then they're just wholly unprepared for kind of, what the world looks like on the other side when they really get their first taste of like true growth. So no, definitely see that all the time. And that's definitely something that I think about. Some days it feels, kind of arrogant to be like, hey, I need to prepare for growth because, when you're just kind of, starting out, you'll take, take anything. And you're just happy to kind of, continue to, to meet your clients where you can. But, I think you're right. There's some companies that are just like wholly unprepared, and that's definitely something that you have to think about a lot when you start a company.
Yeah, but I think like that kind of notion of scaling and stuff applies to personal life. I mean, I remember having conversations with my kids or now with younger staff. It's like, where do you want to be in 5 years? Where do you want to be in 10 years? Now, how do you get there? What's the path? You're telling me you want to be at this place in 5 years. Cool. But like, what is your journey there? And I remember when I was, a single parent for a lot of years, and it was hard economically. And I'd have to be like, okay, like we're in this apartment, it's too small. I need to get in a bigger place. Like what's the growth trajectory? And in the markets I was in, it was going job, being a job. All right, I got in 2 years, I'm going to the next thing, and it's got to bump me 10 grand a year or whatever. And, and I finally hit one that gave me a 28 grand bump in a year, and it just changed everything. I was like, oh, now we can like get 3 people out of a 2-bedroom apartment and like move to this next thing. So to me, that's just always been such a useful tool towards like progress. And you can look at it with sobriety too. I mean, it's, people talk about one day at a time, but I also believe in like, where do you want to be in a year and 2 years? And yeah, you might every day need to get up and say like, I'm not drinking today, but also like, what are your goals? You don't just want to kind of cruise along, at least for me. I always am like trying to do better, trying to work better, trying to be a better parent, trying to be a better spouse.
Yeah, no, I actually think about that a lot, because I feel like I'm actually, like, if I'm honest with myself, I'm probably would have failed every time I've tried to figure out where I was, 5 years. If I think about like my life, where I was 15 years ago, there's no way I'm saying, hey, I'm here right now in this moment, and this is what my world looks like. And I think same thing with 10 years. And if I'm being truthful to myself, like, even 5 years ago, if I said like, hey, in 5 years, this is what your world looks like, there's probably no way that I would have, hit the mark of like, hey, this is where I'm going. And I think, to me, it informs me on 2 things. One, this is why I never bet on sports, because it's like I can't even predict my own life. How am I going to predict, what happens on a field somewhere else? And then 2, I think about, optionality a lot, right? And I think that the best way to kind of, view your life or kind of plan it is to like understand like, hey, you're probably not going to be the best person in the world to figure out like, hey, where you're exactly going to be 5 to 10 years, but give yourself as many like options, give yourself as many doors. So in case, your life takes a hard left turn, you still have that the optionality. So I always think about that, like when I'm interacting with people, like, I if a recruiter reaches out, like I always have a conversation. I'm always trying to, meet people and network and work on different skills, because I'm like, at any moment, life could really throw you a curveball, and you want to feel like you have some options, so that when life kind of becomes, unpredictable, at least you can kind of like cling to some things that may be able to direct you back on a path that you kind of had envisioned. But in the same time, it does make me kind of like, embrace fate, and just realize that like there's so much in the world that you can't control. And so I try to control what I can control. But at the same time, like I think just realizing that, just being open to the fate. But going back to sobriety too, it's like, when you lose control drinking alcohol, right, you can get in a lot of problems. And I'm at an age now where I've had friends that have DUIs. I've had friends that, have had drinking issues. And, when you have a record, when you have substance abuse issues, like, you are limiting your options. in life. So when I think about what it means to live a disciplined life, what it means to like, give myself options, it's just like another reason that I come back to, like, hey, probably shouldn't be drinking, but it's not a good use of my time to like go out and be drinking like, some of my counterparty.
Yeah. And as you get older, it just is worse for you. But what you were saying before, it reminded me, I can't even remember who or where I read this. It talked about like gravity problems versus anchor problems. So like gravity problems, they're immovable, right? You can't change gravity. It's a constant. So like, gravity problem could be, my boss at this company or the owner of the company, right? You're not going to change an owner of a company. It's just gravity. So you have to change something else if that situation like isn't working. And I thought that was a pretty useful lens for me to be like, okay, I mean, just sort of serenity prayer-ish, right? It's like, what can I change? What can I not change? What can I accept?
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. It's one of those things where, maybe we grew up in a world where like, they tell you, hey, you can do anything. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But what they don't teach you is like, hey, no one in the world is really going to be your advocate or have your back better than you. And just being able to kind of give yourself the ability to like not limit yourself, not hinder yourself, and kind of stay course is some of the best things you can do. Because even for business, I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs, and the best advice that I've ever got is for guys that are successful. They say, the first few years, like they're going to suck. If you meet any entrepreneur that says like, oh, everything's great, like I'm blowing out of the water, I opened my shop and now I'm an overnight millionaire. That's just not the reality most of the time. The reality is that it sucks, but if you have a good head above yourself and you kind of are doing the right things, it's going to work out. You just have to stay above water long enough. And I think that's true in business. And I think it's true in life, that if you do the right things and you just keep your head above water long enough, like you'll make it to shore. It's just the people that kind of keep their eye off, what they're supposed to be doing, and they let themselves, wander out to sea, are people that unfortunately get into a lot of trouble. And so, just really kind of harkens back to why I think, living a disciplined life is so important, and why like doing things like, being drug free, being alcohol free is such an important piece of that.
Yeah, it's like you make the right decision and then you look at what's the next right decision and then the next one. It's like you just got to take steps. And I think that's right. It's true in business. It's true in life. It's true as a spouse. It's true as a parent. It is like, okay, what's the next right thing I need to do?
Yeah.
Stop,
and
look around. Okay, go.
Yeah, I think being a new parent too, it's like, you can read like, whatever book you want to read, or go to whatever, hospital-led class you can go to learn what it means to be a parent. But really, I think with like being a parent, you have this appreciation, like, oh my God, like no one knows what the heck, they're doing, just kind of making it up. And so if I can feel like, hey, I'm doing what I believe in my heart is like the right thing as a parent, it may not work out every time, but I can feel good every night when I put my kid to bed, like, hey, I did everything that I think is the right thing to do here. And I can like look myself in the face and like feel like, okay, I maybe just be completely making it up and freestyling it, but I feel like at least if I make like the small right decisions kind of add up over time, and they really kind of compound and hopefully give my kid a good life,
Yeah, I had to learn along the way also to like forgive myself for not being the perfect parent, because you definitely are not going to always make the right decision, or you might lose your cool, or whatever it is. And so you try and learn from that and not do it again, but also just forgiving yourself when you stumble, because I do think, and not to tie like everything back to work or whatever, people are so afraid of making mistakes. I think in life and all things that it kind of can paralyze them. But I remember, the oldest is over 21 now, and I still remember leaving the hospital going like, oh my God, who said this was a good idea? Like this little, and sleeping with a light on that night with the baby, like you just don't know. And you could have had nieces or babysat or whatever. It is a different deal when they're just this little tiny little human being that can't do anything. And you're like, oh man, I'm in it now.
Yeah. No, it's crazy because I look at my daughter and then realize like I'm her dad, and it's like this weird thing where you have to realize like for the rest of her life, like no matter what happens, like I'll always be her dad. And that to me is like such a heavy thing when you really kind of think about it, and like the responsibility, that it's like, hey, it's like, she's going to look to me one day and like hope that I have the answers for her. And I just have to, do things both in my life and, so that I can be that good example for her. And I think, that's just another reason why that you really, have to, think about like the actions you make. And I think there's this level of like selfishness, you really have to give yourself to a whole nother person, because I feel like, it's so cliche and corny when I heard it, but it's when people say like when your kids are born, you kind of stop living for yourself and you look for them and you're like, oh man, that just sounds like, Disney Channel kind of crazy, but it's true. Like I just feel like the days of like, hey, I can go out and, muck around with my friends and be like immature, is like those days are over. Like I have a kid now, I have a responsibility. I have someone that looks at me like I'm the person that's going to like drive the ship, until they're a certain age. And it's just, it's crazy. It's a lot. And I feel like it's always unfortunate for people that grew up in homes that didn't have the parents that like, that made the choices. I didn't have the world's greatest, childhood, and I carry that weight a lot, to where like it's so present for me to be like, whatever happens, I have to, give my kid a life that the little boy inside of me like wishes that he had. And I think too, starting a company and just like, having phones being accessible, that's the one thing that they don't talk about is, being remote is great, because like, hey, you have the flexibility, but it also sometimes breaks these barriers where like people think like you can be accessible, 24/7, because it's like, hey, I just hopped on a Zoom, with you halfway across the country. So like you can probably, answer an email at 8:00 at night. And so I sometimes catch myself, and I think right now that's like my next journey is to learn like, how do I put the phone down? How do I really be present for my kid? Because, sometimes in life, it's easy just, like when your kid's playing or they're watching, or you put them in front of a TV so you can like, respond to an email. And, that compounds, that adds up over time. And I think, my next journey as a father is to really think about like, hey, what does it mean to be present for your kids? Like, fully, to be able to put the phone away and even the phone's away, just to keep it out, like out of your mind, because sometimes, you can drag things, you can have like a bad day at work, or, bad day with your relationship, and bring that in. So just kind of clearing the mind.
Yeah, I think I'm 21 years into the, I think I think that's like a constant thing of learning. Because the older ones now they're happy to like be in their room, doing their thing. Or my 17-year-old, she's a senior in high school. Like she's got a job. She's really busy. And then it's like making sure you're still making time, even when they're older, in some ways when they're young, because they sort of demand it of you. But yeah, like I try to not check work email on the weekends. Like I try and work diligently Monday through Friday. Like I'm certainly willing to do it if there's a deadline or something we need to do. Like I will do it, but I really try and structure it so that I don't have to do that. I also am working for other people, so it's a little easier. And I think where I work also is pretty family focused, and that really helps. And I think the work world has changed a little bit, but I interviewed one guy, and he's like, I get home from work and I put my phone in my office until the kid's asleep. I was like, that's really good. I don't do that, because there's nothing worse than like the parent of a teenager telling their teenager to get off their phone when they're dicking around on their own phone.
Yeah.
Like true. It's that do as I say, not as I do, which I think a lot of parents do, which is kind of not cool, because kids definitely, they observe that. They're like, well, you're telling me like this, or you're telling me that. It's why I believe like parents should apologize. Like if you're like, man, sorry, I lost my temper. Like you're going to expect your kids to apologize for things. You should definitely apologize.
Yeah.
You're not going to be perfect, but it seems fair.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. And I think it's just one of those battles that, it's so easy just to like fall into the trap of like, hey, let me check the email, or let me look at the text, or let me, like refresh this or that. And then, I think now too, dads always tell me that like, hey, you really need to, enjoy this time. My kid's only, 2 years old, because there'll probably be a day when like, it's like no longer cool to hang around dad. You want to go and hang out with your friends or do whatever. But now it's like this really like special, perfect moment where you're still like the hero in their story. So,
yeah, I think one thing I definitely figured out is if you don't establish that like trust and relationship when they're young, don't expect to have it when they're 16. But if you haven't established that open, honest, you can ask me a question, I'm going to give you an honest answer thing, when they're like a teenager and they're out and about, when the stakes are higher, they might not come to you. I mean, we always say like, you got to no questions asked exit strategy from any situation that's bad. You just call or text. And no questions asked, you and any of your friends, we will get you out of that situation. Talk about it later. We will just get you and we will go. And I think if you don't early on sort of just establish that, it's not going to be there later. It doesn't magically appear. It's the same way I think like dad's the most incredible title you can get, but I also believe you earn it. Mm-hmm. It's just not given. They're born. People call you dad, but I feel like every day you kind of have to like do things to earn the honor of that. I'd rather be called dad than be knighted. Sure. It's the most important thing. It's the reason I work hard at work. It's like the filter for all the things.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. I think you're right. It's such a cool, magical journey to be a dad. And, I think about, sometimes, you can have like one view of a parent is like, hey, do I need to be, tough on my kid? Do I need to like, instill? And I think it's such a generational thing where it kind of like turns over. It's like, based on your generation, you had parents that like came back from World War II and they had like a certain way of like disciplining their kids. And then you kind of saw it was a lot more like, those kids grew up and they wanted to be relaxed and, just kind of like cycles in and out based on the generation. But I think for me, it's like, I've just decided when I had a kid, like I just want to be the parent that I wish that I had as a kid, and so I think being the person, like almost a friend first. And some people say, some people look down on that. Some people say, oh, like you're not your kid's friend, you like you're their parent. But for me, I've always thought like, parents are great, but I knew a lot of kids who, grew up with discipline, parents where, there was this bifurcation, and now they don't have a great relationship. They're like 30, 40 years old, and, they don't have a relationship with their parents because there was never that foundation of being a true friend. And so I think about, being a true friend first and being a parent, alongside. And maybe I'm wrong. It's like I'm just making up as I go along, but that's kind of my first foray into it, is like, if I have a foundation where like this child can rely on me and like call me in any pinch because they think of me as someone that like has their best interest, then that'll be a lot better than the parent who are like, strict and, like heavy-handed.
Yeah, I think like, discipline is an interesting thing, which what you said sort of touches on. Like, I've always felt like I don't really want to punish anybody. Like, people are going to make mistakes. It just is what it is. But isn't the point to just learn from that and not, and it certainly, there are things that warrant some sort of consequence or whatever. But in the end, to me, the goal is, well, that wasn't cool. So let's talk about that and how that's not going to happen again. Right. And it, the older they get, I think if you're like, now you're grounded or what, like, that's just going to create resentment and the likelihood of more stuff going on or them not being willing to tell you something.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree.
I mean, baseballs go through windows, like accidents happen. People lose their temper. Homework doesn't get done. Lunch boxes get left at school for a week. That happened recently. It wasn't as gross as we thought. One of the older kids once left a lunchbox under their bed for 2 weeks, and I found it, and I just threw it right away.
Man. Yeah.
I started to open it, and I was like, nope, there's something scary in there. That is going right in the trash. But, it's also sort of, like, that stuff's sort of funny, too, in the end. You're like, there was once the oldest one, it was like leftover chili, and he was getting it, and he knocked, it was like in a ceramic storage dish, and he knocked it off the stove, and it like bounced, and it went down into the basement. And I just laughed. I was like, it was just so random, and the lid was like left, so I wrote like, in Sharpie, like I made a trophy out of the lid, because like, what are you gonna do? Like, he didn't do it on purpose. He didn't like throw it down there. It just, maybe you should have had it a little more on the edge of the counter. It's just a thing. It broke. It was sort of funny. It was really messy. We all cleaned it up. We laughed about it, and we moved on. I don't like lord over him with that. To this day, years later, I'm like, oh, that time you blah, 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 like, nobody wants that to happen to them. Like, I think families do that kind of stuff a lot. The memory is deep and you just want to be able to move on from your mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So baby number 2 is on the way. When's that happening?
Yeah. Baby number 2 is coming in February.
Oh, coming
in February. No name yet. It's one of those things where I thought we had a name, and then the wife said, woke up today, it's like, maybe I don't like that name, and it's like, all my names are bad, dumb. All
you had the list, the 2 columns, his and her names,
his and her. Yeah, it's basically, oh, these are bad names, and here are the names we're gonna go. So you pick one. No, but I'm fine with whatever, like the wife wants. I had a really close relationship with my grandfather when I was a kid. Kind of grew up. I feel like, he really raised me in a lot of respects. And so, his name's Harvey. So that will be the middle name. And then wherever the first name ends up, that's, I'll be happy with it,
Yeah, my oldest, his middle name is Richard because both the grandfather's first names were Richards. We're like, score. Easy crowd pleaser right there.
Exactly.
No, we weren't sure of the first name. We knew the gender, but we're like, the middle name we got that one down. So
that's right.
Yeah, and it's interesting with like naming. It's interesting to like name a human being, right? Like there's a lot of weight with a name when you think about it. Wow, that's you don't get to pick your own name. You guess you can. You can switch, but like most of us stick with what we got.
Yeah, that's right. And I remember seeing my daughter's name on her birth certificate and be like, oh my goodness, like that's like this is a real person, and this is the name that we gave her, and this is like and now like she's into the world, and it's like a crazy thing because it's like I guess everyone's parents have a name. Some names arguably could be better than other names. I never loved my name. But hopefully whatever name we give the son is not one that can be turned into like a threatening rhyme on the playground, because that's
what we always said, like not the name that's going to get him beat up.
Yeah, exactly.
There's like enough things in life that might cause that to happen, so don't like make it no made up names. Did you read Freakonomics? You seem like a guy that would have read Freakonomics.
I did, yeah. I read Freakonomics a long time ago.
There was that chapter on the woman who named her daughter Temptress.
Mm-hmm.
She thought it was Tempest from the actress who had been on the Cosby Show, but named her Temptress. Yeah. And then I think she became a prostitute, and the judge was like, do you know what you like named your kid?
Yeah.
Whoops.
Yeah, there was a kid I went to elementary school, and his name was Mike. And they said Mike rides a trike, and this was like when you're in 5th grade, and it was like devastating, and like and he never really fully recovered from being like Mike, the guy that rides the trike. And I just think about like, man, I gotta think about like what are some things that could rhyme with names that could really just like end the kid's career before it even starts,
I mean, and that's like mild old school. I feel like now, like what I hear, I'm like, holy cow, it's not way more than Mike rides a trike. But it's interesting because kids sort of will be mean, but that comes back to like, what kind of person are you trying to raise? Like, what example do you set? I remember reading Brene Brown and her talking about, she does also research on shame and guilt. I'm trying to get the story right. She talks about this example in the book, and like the teenage girl says to her mom, like, I want to go to this party, and the mom says no because like the parents aren't going to be home, and the girl says, you suck, I hate you, you're like ugly, you're blah blah blah, and then the mom was like, okay, you can go. And the girl goes to the party, and someone wants her to drink, someone wants her to have sex, whatever it is, and she says no, and like, oh, we hate you, so then what's the example that you've been said is like, oh, if people just pressure you and are unkind to you, you just sort of do what they want. So then you make, potentially life-altering decisions. And I always thought that was like a pretty insightful, like, story about it's not do as I say, not as I do. It's I need to be the example, the thing. And I'm certainly not perfect at it. Like, I don't think any of us are, but we're going for the macro, right? We're going for the winning average is doing the right thing every time is with humility. But it's not always easy.
No, definitely not always easy. There's definitely times when you think about like, hey, it could be a lot easier to do something that's not great. But
it's like that parenting with power and not right. Like you can sometimes sort of raise your voice or threaten, right, to get in the short term what you want. But the long term, I think consequences of that are antithetical of all the other things we said. That doesn't build relationship, right? 2-year-olds can be very frustrating. they're amazing and delightful, but also can be really difficult because they don't want to do what they don't want to do.
That's right. But I think from a feedback loop perspective, it's actually a pretty good training ground as a parent to realize like, hey, you got to come at them a certain way, because there's been times when like my daughter's doing something and I'm kind of quick or snap at it, and then they freak out just as, it's like worse. Like, if you had taken it a more calm, softer demeanor, it's better than sometimes being quick or snapping. And so you get this this negative feedback loop where you're like, okay, I just need to I need to keep my wits about me and not let this 2-year-old bully me, which he does.
And it's hard when you start to get a little steam coming out your ears.
Yeah.
And that's when you got to figure out how to kind of step back and calm yourself down. And I think each kid is also different. Like I knew, my oldest kind of had to like step away and then come back, and so it's figuring out like what each person needs. And sometimes it's like giving the room for people to have grace, and like they can be wrong or they blew their top or whatever, but they can kind of come back to that with grace. And like, okay, that kind of sucked that happened. And we're going to talk about it, but we're going to talk about it calmly, and then we're going to move on.
And I think too, like that's an interesting point, because having a second kid is going to be such an interesting thing where like they're going to have different personalities, and I'm not, like one, it's like, I had no idea what my daughter was going to be like, no idea what they're going to look like. And then now she's one way, and it's going to be kind of this weird mental thing where now it's like, I have a playbook now to how to deal with my kid, because, you kind of have to fall into this routine, right? It's like the survival routine, like, hey, she needs, milk, she needs her teddy bear, she needs this and that. And then now to have like a different kid that it may be like a whole different playbook is definitely something that I think will be interesting going from 1 to 2.
And you're like, you don't outnumber them anymore.
Yeah, that's right.
And you're trying to meet like you said, the different needs of different people. And, they get these ages that are, sort of silly to pick movies, but there are times when they want to watch the same movies. And we're sort of in this now with like 8 and 12 are so different with like what's sort of appropriate, both in their personalities and just in a broad sense, like what is appropriate for those ages. And it can make like family movie night kind of hard. And of course, they want to get what they want. So, there are these periods where it's like hard to navigate people's needs at different ages. And then, as you get older, you get more freedoms, and, you sort of earn those by responsibility and all that. But the younger ones might not actually see all that's behind the sort of like, oh, well, why does this person get to do this? Well, they're older, but also they've done all these things along the way that like lead us to believe they're responsible to go take the car and drive away from the house on their own, and that we trust the car is going to come back in one piece. They're not going to drink, all that stuff. You're a little ways away from that.
Yeah, no, it is interesting, especially now that I have this like combo boy and girl, because I remember distinctly when we were finding out the gender of my daughter, like, kind of was like, hey, I kind of want a, boy, but I'm, happy for what, either, as long as they're healthy, right? That's what everyone says. And we had a girl, and I mean, it's just like, it's so great. Like the father-daughter relationship is such like a beautiful thing, to a point where like when we were finding out the gender for the second, I was like, I kind of wouldn't mind a girl, because that's what I know. That's like, I love it. I love being a girl dad. So now having a boy, not only, well, with their personalities inevitably be different, but I think thinking about like, what does it mean to be a dad to a girl, and what does it mean to be a dad to a, to your son?
Yeah, and there are some differences. I mean, I remember with the oldest having these long conversations about consent and like how to be a good man in this world and what that means. And, some of it feels very like rigidly gendered a little bit in a way that maybe the world isn't now, but in broad things, right? You ask for consent and
Sure.
you watch out. I remember them going to their first like music festival, and I was like, here's the deal. You watch them. If they need to go to the bathroom, you go, you hold their drinks. You make sure nobody messes with their drinks. Like all these, these are real world practical things for like being a good person and a good friend. And I'm the kind of person like, we're just putting it out there on the table. Like there's stuff and there's people out there that are not good people. And so your job is to help, protect your siblings or your friends out there and watch out for them, because there are people out there who are just not trustworthy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I mean, interesting too, right? Like, how's it been having kids that, can now drink and like, do you have those conversations with them? And like, how do you deal with, sobriety and like letting your kids drink?
Yeah. I mean, the oldest I think he has a beer every once in a while. His mom's house is like a glass of wine with dinner kind of thing. And it seems healthy. He knows where I'm at in my background, and we sort of talk about that as a thing, but you also can't make them do stuff. So you're hoping that, what you've shown and what you've talked about at least gives them a lens or a framework to have some critical eye on what they're doing, right? Because now, more and more places like weed's legal, right? And what does that mean? And, just how to be safe. But, it is interesting sort of being a sober parent, and we're totally, there's no alcohol in our house. Like when my wife and I, we got married, we didn't have alcohol at our wedding. Like sobriety is a very key component in our relationship. So all the kids see that. And I think, some of it is that leading by example thing. And I think the older kids, especially the oldest one, is probably the one that remembers when I drank. He's the only one that's probably old enough. The stepkids, they don't know any other version of me. But I think some of that is just showing like what you do and talking about why, being honest about like, I mean, I think in my life, I was probably only drunk 5 times. I was like the guy that had 2-3 glasses of wine every night, it's like medicinal. And I was like, this is not good. This is not the treatment for the depression you're having, and it's not helping your migraines. It's not doing any of that stuff. But, the culture around alcohol, which I think there is a shift, I think with younger people, there's definitely a shift. Seems like fewer people are drinking, but, the culture and the marketing and, oh, it's healthy, or, dads have a beer with the game and mommy wine time. Like a lot of that, it's really insidious.
Yeah.
And, as a parent, right, you have to sort of fight against that, or there's all this stuff like, your kids aren't watching YouTube, but like all these, but it's real. I saw it on YouTube. No, it's not real. Like that stuff, those kids aren't actually breaking into their neighbor's pool. This is all staged, and like that thing that looks like a cool video is actually just an ad. It's really sort of teaching this how to be a savvy person. I mean, my wife as a therapist talks about, social media literacy for young people. Adults also need it, right? Like how to understand like what's out there, what's real, what's not real, which is pretty sophisticated, right? There's like a lot of, and it's getting more and more complicated, but trying to, really help kids understand the world that they're surrounded by and look at it in a real way and figure out how, like, what their path through it is, because it's complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. And the social media thing, I think, is such an interesting thing, because I feel like there's stuff that at our time and experience, you can say like, okay, that's clearly staged, right? There's a lot of stuff like, like this YouTube stuff where they, it's supposed to be like candid camera, but it's really like, okay, this is fake, this is staged. But there is this whole nother element that I think that like even we deal with too. It's like, especially on like a LinkedIn, where people are always like presenting outwardly, like, how great their life is and these success and these milestones. And I think, there's a part where even like now as adults, it's like, it's healthy to remind yourself like, hey, that's not always, healthy too, because it's so easy to see the obvious stuff. But then you're like, oh man, so-and-so is in my like, they're in my demographic cohort, like they're my age, but they seem to be killing it because they're posting these grand vacations, or, it's like, it's a lot more subtle and obvious. And I don't know if we as a society can really fully understand like the mental anguish that we have put on our society by having a culture where everyone feels that not only do they have to post it, but you have such access to see it like day over day over day. And I think when you see like the rates of like, depression and anxiety, I think that's no coincidence that it's like, it just becomes this like omnipresent thing where it's like, it's one thing, years ago before, the internet, where you just kind of had to compete, amongst your neighbors or like, where you grew up. And now it's like anywhere you go, you can find out what Mike the Trike is up to these days. And, he's killing it because, everyone teased him as a kid. And so now he's driving, sports cars and everything's great. And it's like, you're just like, you could never lose the bubble. And it's so easy to kind of go in this trap. And so so it's such an interesting thing. But, too, about being a parent is that like sometimes there's things that I like immediately tell my daughter because I'm like, oh, I know this is wrong. But then when I think about it later, I'm like, man, there's a lot of stuff that like I probably could listen to myself sometimes and realize like, hey, there's stuff as an adult that you still kind of miss the mark on.
Yeah. No, I don't know if I've ever seen someone on LinkedIn be like, man, I made this big mistake today.
Yeah.
And this is what I learned from it.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see if someone did that, like what the reaction is. I mean, it's why I started talking about sobriety publicly too, was like, I felt like there was misunderstandings of what, sober folks look like, a lot of stereotypes. People don't think about it in the professional context, right? Because we're always just like, look at me, and it's just this world of like photoshopped this and that, or what you're seeing, or people only put up the stuff when they look like they're killing it.
Yeah.
They don't always post the grind.
Sure.
I didn't post the one time in my entire career like I missed the deadline.
Mm-hmm.
And it was terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
I was like, whoa, that, so then like, all right, what did I learn from that? Like, what am I going to do about that? And, there's a lot of intersections. That's a whole long story, but it was like a lot of things went into that, I had some role in and other people had other roles. And it was like this perfect storm. And I'm like, oh, crap.
Yeah.
That wasn't good. But you learn from it and you move on, and I didn't get fired. And like, there you go. But no one posts about that stuff.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I think too, that's one thing that I hope my daughter realizes, is that like there's stuff too that happens, good or bad, that you can just keep to yourself, and that like sometimes there's like this pressure that everyone needs to be like updating their status and their location and taking pictures before they eat a meal. And it's like, at some point it's like you can just live your life, you don't have to feel hidebound to like letting everyone know,
Yeah, I put up a work anniversary for someone on LinkedIn, and he's not on LinkedIn. He's like, I'm not on any of that. I don't do any of it.
Yeah. No, it's. I mean, I'm pretty much only really on LinkedIn and Twitter, and I try to stay off all the other ones. And if I could, I'd probably get off LinkedIn too, but it's so helpful for work and like making connections and keeping track. But sometimes it's just nice to be like, I'm just gonna live my life the best I can, and like, I'm not gonna constantly be uploading my feed to see how I'm tracking versus my peers.
Yeah, and it's been interesting sort of with the podcast because I've sort of started to, at first I was like, oh, like this many likes. I'm like, I put it out there. I've gotten enough feedback that people find value, and I don't check a lot of the metrics. I just kind of do it. And, LinkedIn's been an interesting place where there's been growth where I didn't necessarily expect it. And that's kind of refreshing, because there's a lot of interesting people have interesting stories. And, LinkedIn, most of it's been on Instagram. I kind of walked away from Twitter. I couldn't take it anymore.
Sure.
That's a whole, that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, it's a funny world because you just see what people want you to see. And then I think, would anyone even care? Especially just like if I put up a vacation picture, does anyone actually care?
Yeah.
I'm in touch with all these people from high school on Facebook. I still go back to Maine where I grew up. Do I actually see any of them? I don't. So what's the purpose of quote unquote having these friends on Facebook?
Yeah.
I never see them. I don't correspond with them.
Yeah, it's a super fair point, but I will say just to contradict myself here is, bashing social media, I think can be like a very easy low hanging fruit because I think everyone knows like the risks. But then I think about something like this, like I'm talking to someone from Tompkins County, New York, and like, for the last hour, we've had a good conversation. We've like opened up and like let each other into each other's lives. And I'm like, without this social media, I've never had this like unique experience. So it's the thing that like, when I say like, hey, there's a lot of, harm and issues with, our societal, reliance on social media. But the reason why I think I keep coming back and using it is because you do get a lot of like these unique relationships that you've never had, you didn't have, the internet. When I was a kid, there was this chat box called Ventrilo. This is like old internet lore. And it was basically for people that played like World of Warcraft and like other games. It was basically like before there was like an Xbox Live. And I didn't play any, video games, but I was just like a curious, like 13-year-old kid that just wanted to like, explore it. And I realized you could put like different codes and it would open you to like different rooms, right? Like these different like chat rooms where people would be talking. So basically like Twitter Spaces before there was, like Twitter Spaces and I entered a room where there was a bunch of guys and they had like thick Long Island, like New York accents. And they were talking about, like the Yankees and the Giants. And I grew up in Minnesota, but there weren't many Elis in the world, but there was a quarterback named Eli Manning. And I grew up a devout Giants fan because I was like, this is my hero because he's got my name. And I remember just like being in this group in my parents' basement in Minnesota, like talking to these guys that were like my age or a little bit older about Giants football. And I became good friends with a guy named Paul, and we stayed in touch, like, like for years and years and years. And I met him for the first time like 3-4 years ago, like in person, and we just hit it off. We'd been friends throughout our life, but we had never met. We had just met in this like chat room when we were 13, like stayed friends on like Facebook and like other things. And then I met him, and now he's become like a very instrumental part of my life. Like he was in my wedding. I talk to him weekly, like, like all the time. And I think, that's just like a cool world that we live in. That like, it's going to be hard for me as a parent to be like, I don't want my kids, talking to strangers online, because like, like your first gut reaction is like, there are bad actors, and you need to protect your kid. But if I hadn't been this like mischievous, 13-year-old that was like entering random chat rooms, I would have never had like a lifelong friend. So it is just a very interesting place in the internet where I I think it's like, it's maybe too early to say like, is this like a necessary evil? Is this is it a net positive, net negative? But I think there are some great things, and there are some and there's some real negative things, and you just have to figure out like, you know well, it, like, where's your right place, and is this a good use of time, or not? And sometimes I think in life there's no easy answer. There's contradictions to truth. And I think because there's so many variable outcomes that you can experience in this lifetime, that it's hard to just say with any finite precision, like, this is good, this is bad. I think you just have to like live your life kind of in the gray. And that's kind of the way I do. I just think I can't predict what my life looks like, but if I just do the right things, and I can, be disciplined, and be truthful to myself, and I can like make it through this kind of grayness of life.
Yeah, I think that's good. And to sort of circle back for parenting a little bit, my wife and I, we always talk about like guardrails. Mm-hmm. Like, as a parent, like, our job is sort of to put up the guardrails, and they like shift, right, as the kids get older. The ultimate goal of the guardrail is just to keep the car from flying off the road. I kind of got to let you drive it. I'm just trying to keep you from flying off the road. That doesn't mean you're not going to hit a pothole, because you're gonna. It's okay. You might get a flat tire or whatever. It's sort of a tired metaphor, but, and those guardrails shift as they get older, right? The guardrails that a 2-year-old needs are very different than what an 8-year-old needs or a 17-year-old needs. The height of them or whatever. But, right, social media is out there. So to just keep your kid off of it all doesn't also work. So it's like, here's just sort of the broad, like, guardrails along the road, and please, like, communicate with me. And if something feels weird, like, ask me. I'm not going to take away your Snapchat, but like, if something feels off, trust yourself, and, let us know, when we can and see. But I think you're right about gray area. So much is gray and unknown, and and in the gray is also the beauty and the discomfort.
Yeah, and I think too, like, to go back to your flat tire, such an interesting analogy, because in a lot of ways, like when I'm at the playground now with my daughter, like, I am the guardrails, like, 'cause she's like fearless, and like will try to climb on things she shouldn't. So I'm always trying to like prevent her. But I think in life, even if you put up the guardrails, like, the sad truth is that the kid needs to have a flat tire, because if they don't have a flat tire, they're never going to know how to change the flat tire. And I think that will be the hardest part of parenting, will be accepting the fact that, like, there are days when my kid's going to hit a pothole, they're going to have a flat tire, and there's nothing as a parent that I can do to have prevented that.
Yeah, I remember with the oldest, we were on some kind of hike, and there's like a down tree, and he started to climb up it. My first thought was, oh, don't do that. And I'm like, no, you know what? Like, I'm not going to die if he falls. Like, I don't want him to break his arm, but like, eventually he broke his arm playing soccer, right? Like, it happens. So I was like, no, I kind of got to let you like climb the tree. If it's a 100-foot tree, and don't want you to go to the top, but you kind of got to try and do the thing, and you might fall, and you might get a little bit hurt.
Yeah. No, it's just one of those things where it's like, you can keep them safe with as much as you can, but at some point, like sometimes when my daughter does stuff she shouldn't, and I stop her over and over again, and I'm just like, all right, go ahead and and do it. And then blocks come tumbling down, and she, she has to learn, like, hey, that's, sometimes when you do stuff, there are consequences, and it's like this weird line, because you're like, I'm responsible for this human's health and well-being, but at the same time, like, they kind of have to learn, and it's always challenging to know, like, when do I step in, or when do I just like let them learn the lessons on their own?
Yeah. I think that's a super cool message to stop with. So thank you so much for being on.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I truly appreciate it. And I'm glad that I can now say I've been on a podcast.
Thanks for listening. Sober Dad Crew is a DIY project by Stephen Kimball, who writes, edits, and produces the show. To support the show, please review it where you listen to podcasts, or visit soberdadcrew.com to buy some merchandise or make a donation.